Now may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be ever more acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Be seated. Unity in diversity, scattering and gathering. The final story of the primordial history as told in Genesis explains the diversity of human society. In the beginning, the whole earth had one language and the same words. As human society grew and developed, so did humanity's hubris, our desire for notoriety and power to control our fate. Let us build ourselves a city, the people proposed. Let us make a name for ourselves. Empire building, it would seem, has always been a thing. And in an odd moment of insecurity, God decides to change the course of history, saying, let us go down and confuse their language there so that they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth. Scattered across the world, the diversity of the global community was born. Traveling abroad, or even within Canada, reminds us of the power of language. Language describes our world and our experiences such that it embodies and defines us in profound ways. We only have to think of the up and down relationship between Canada and Quebec to see the importance of language. Quebec continues to write laws that require French to be primary, to be front and center, to protect the French language from being swallowed up by the English all around it. This impulse points to the reality that language is about more than simple communication. It is about deeply who we are. It defines our culture and our communities. The challenge of not knowing the language is obvious when we're in non-English speaking places. But in English speaking places that are not Canada or are otherwise unfamiliar, the nuance of language can be both less immediately obvious and more disconcerting. I've learned, for instance, that the term condo means something a bit different here in BC than it does in Alberta. Not wholly different, of course, but there are distinctions that can mean confusion or misunderstanding. I encountered the dynamic even more intensely during a summer internship on the Caribbean island of St. Vincent. Like us, it is a former British colony with English as the common language. I discovered along the way, however, that familiar words didn't always mean what I thought they did. An occasion of a parish dinner for which people bought tickets, for instance, meant people stopping by the church on their way home from work to pick up their box dinner and take it home. Not what I expected from a parish dinner. I know what a parish dinner is. It wasn't what I expected. Turns out I didn't know. It turned out that the words, the language, meant something different than what I thought. That confusion of language, misunderstanding each other's speech, happens a lot. And too often, it still means that communities are scattered, gathering only or primarily in more smaller, more comfortable, homogeneous units. In our Pentecost celebration today, we hear a story reversing that scattering that occurred back in Genesis. The story begins with the disciples together all in one place, like we are today. And then suddenly there is noise and commotion, a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and divided tongues as of fire appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. Filled with the Holy Spirit, the disciples began to speak other languages. Cacophony of sound comes from a multitude of foreign languages being spoken, and that commotion draws a crowd. Devout Jews of Jerusalem who hailed from all over the world could suddenly understand the Galilean disciples. chaos of the disciples' sudden ability to speak different languages then leads to a different outcome than back in Genesis. Instead of scattering, people gathered. The power the disciples received when they were filled with the Holy Spirit was the power to communicate beyond their own small community. There was a time not so long ago that we spoke only one language in the Anglican Church. Indeed, the Church of England was formed by a singular language, the Book of Common Prayer. I have no desire to look into the hearts of men, Queen Elizabeth I declared, and it became the hallmark of the Elizabethan settlement way back in the 17th century or so. In other words, she meant, I do not care what you believe or what you understand by the words in the book, as long as you say them and assent to them. One prayer book, one language, one set of words. This is the foundation, the unity upon which the Anglican Church was built. And as the Church of England scattered across the world with the British Empire and became the Anglican Communion, we have struggled with the unity in our diversity, the diversity of culture, the diversity of spirituality, the diversity of worship, of language, of ritual. We have come a long way in the last half century or so, and we have a long way yet to go. In recent years, right here in BC, right here at St. George's, we have begun to speak the language of technology. As suddenly as those first disciples spoke new languages, as we were spurred on by the pandemic. This language of Zoom, of live stream, of video that was so new to many of us now easily rolls off the tongue and into our practice. You have to unmute, you have to unmute. We have come a long way, and we may yet have a ways to go. The language of reconciliation, of colonialism, settler culture, territorial acknowledgement, all these languages are still relatively new to us. We do together know that when someone quotes the number 215, we know what that represents. We're learning languages of intersectionality, of racism, of inequality in new ways. Likewise, languages describing the diversity of gender expression and sexual orientation. Cis versus trans, LGBTQ+, and more are becoming more familiar to us. I wonder what other languages we could learn, that we need to learn, to be heard and understood by people beyond our current community. Languages of spirituality beyond our religious words, church words perhaps. Maybe languages used by younger generations or those disenfranchised from the church. Instead of scattering, the diversity of language at Pentecost led to a deepening of unity. It's what happens when a community begins organizing around a common understanding and a common purpose, rather than cultural expression or specific words. The sudden and dramatic diversity of language at the first Pentecost meant that the mission of God and the purpose of the church could reach further than a community limited by singularity, uniformity. Such is the power of God given us by the Holy Spirit to gather the scattered community, unified in our diversity.